This is the last section, the last panel discussion on some recommendations that we made at the level of regulators. And actually, Niamh already mentioned very well the recommendations that we made for policy at the pan-European level. But Eva Lievens, who is here among us and who, with colleagues, made this report that really deals with regulation. What are the gaps in EU regulation? What can we, with our ySKILLS evidence, recommend to the regulators in light of all the changes that Niamh also pointed at, the GDPR, the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, what else do we have? The Digital Service Act, etc. So, Eva, could you tell us what, in fact, what sharp recommendations that we have for the regulators in store?
Okay, thank you, Leen. So yes, indeed, together with my colleague Iro and our colleagues Benedetta, Marta and Claudia from the University of Milan, our task was effectively to take the recommendations for EU policymakers, which Niamh just presented, and to map those recommendations on the existing policy and legal framework at the EU level. And I think Niamh said it very well. Since the start of our ySKILLS project, at the EU level, policymakers, legislators have been enormously active. So this is what our mapping has brought to light. If we look into the documents and the instruments that exist today, there are many documents that might potentially affect children in the digital environment. Some documents refer more to skills of children than others, but for instance, at the policy level, we have the Better Internet for Kids Plus strategy, with an important focus on skills in the second pillar. We have a very important declaration on digital rights and principles, which explicitly refers to digital skills of children. So important commitments are made in that regard at the EU level. And if we look at the level of legislation, we have all these new instruments that have been adopted. So especially the GDPR, of course, but also the Digital Services Act, which is really directed at the platforms, imposing obligations on the platforms, also obligations to protect children and to ensure a high level of privacy, safety and security. So these documents have a lot of potential to affect how children experience this digital environment on a day-to-day basis. At the same time, the documents are very recent. I think the GDPR, we have the GDPR since 2018, and only really in the last 2 years, we see that enforcement of the regulation is being taken up. We see decisions by data protection authorities that have an effect. For instance, the DPC fine of 345 million euros on TikTok because of the way in which they handle children's personal data. But it takes time. It takes time for this enforcement to speed up. So I think one of the important messages of our ySKILLS project is to really invest in implementation, making sure that there is guidance for the companies. How, for instance, do they need to design these mechanisms for which children's digital skills are really important? For instance, privacy settings. We had an item in the YDSI about privacy settings. Reporting mechanisms. These are important mechanisms in the legislation, but we need to make sure that the way in which the platforms are designed, that they make it possible for children to really use these in a meaningful way. So implementation, enforcement, I think is crucial. And in addition, if we look at the policies, a lot of efforts are being made in relation to digital skills of children. Only last week, there were 2 recommendations adopted by the Council of the European Union on digital skills in education. But what we also have noticed when we have mapped all these documents is that there is still not sufficient attention for the vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities, as it has been such an important part, Niamh as well has emphasized it, we have seen it throughout all the presentations, but vulnerabilities are sometimes referenced, but not in a consistent way. In addition, there is, for instance, a lot of attention for critical thinking in latest policy documents, especially in relation to disinformation, but much less attention for other dimensions of digital skills. And that's exactly what ySKILLS is advocating for. And so making sure that there is attention for all the different 4 dimensions of digital skills. So there as well, I think there is definitely room for improvement also at the policy level.
Thank you very much. We started this morning our conversation on this a bit of a panic and emotion that parents may have for the age of the mobile phone. So there's a lot of emotion we see, and it seems that this whole question of digital skills of children, we cannot disconnect it from the views of the parents. So what, in your view, does that tell us for future research and for policy? Can I ask this to the panel members? I don't know who wants to to answer first. Sonia?
So I think the role of parents is so interesting, and it's up, yeah? I thought I had microphone literacy, but I was trying my best. Yeah, so there are so many things to say about parents, and it's one of the things that is put to me most often when people say, but you can't have, children's rights are kind of universal rights. Yeah. And parenting is so cultural, is so variable, is so specific. So in many parts of the world, parents have considerable authority over the possibilities of what their children will do. So even talk, as Fabiola just gave us a great call for children's agency, but children's agency is not recognized everywhere. Children's rights are not recognized everywhere. In the United States, which is just such an important case in terms of the way in which the major corporates offer their digital services to those of us here in Europe, not to mention rest of the world, so much is going through the parent, and increasingly, if you look at the kind of pattern of regulation that's being debated, if not passed, across the different states in America, the direction of travel is to put the parent increasingly between the child and the screen, and the parent becomes the crucial intermediary who, in effect, as I would see it, determines the realization of children's rights in a way that is not anticipated by the Committee on the Rights of the Child, who actually just put out a very smart, short statement about how children's rights, the responsibility of parents is to facilitate the realization of their children's rights, not to exercise their own rights over those of their children. So I think there's so many ways in which we could translate that into debates about what they should be taught in school, what regulation is appropriate, what the role of parents is in relation to parental controls or age verification or privacy, and there's much. It's going to be a lively debate for the next decade, I think.
So lots of research coming up, and the Norwegian perspective in all of this. Do you think, Elisabeth?
Well, since yours about the Norwegian perspective, I can say that also coming from which ySKILLS can say comes largely out of the EU-Kids Online network, and we've done some service in Norway. And when we did the EU-Kids Online survey in 2018, we asked parents about their worries. I think we had 26 worries, and number one, screen time and traffic. But screen time is really, and when we look at trying to figure out what lies behind this great worry, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of things that has to do nothing necessarily with what their child actually does or how they behave, but this generalized worry about the unknown future, which we have talked about, and I think coming from and back to our policy report, what and why would we, for instance, target national and EU level authorities instead of saying these are the recommendations for parents, as we often do, or these are the recommendations for teachers or for schools, is precisely that this is very complex. And we are in a field, almost a minefield, where feelings and fears and uncertainties and also this sense of protection against, like a precautionary principle in every family, parents feeling that they have to take responsibility of this huge scale unknown, it becomes too complicated. And one of the things that I like about our approach in this project in terms of policy is that by very often as researchers we'll give advice to the parents, give advice to the teachers, but by doing that you always let the industry off the hook. Because it becomes this, as Sonia talked about, direct responsibility between the family, the parent, and the child on the screen, and we forget about national authorities, we forget about the industry, we forget about all these other factors. Hopefully this can aid that. And now I can see the Irish colleague where all the European are situated wants to...
Yes, please.
Thank you. I think that the important thing to think about as well is that, you know, the situation that parents find themselves in. So they're faced with this, digitalization of society, they're faced with the digitalization of schools, they're faced with, you know, the increasing prevalence of mobile phones, and this is kind of a wave that they find themselves on. And then they have the media panic discourse that they have to kind of try to navigate through. And so I think that in terms of the recommendations that we have made, both in the national policymakers, but also the educational authorities, there has to be some kind of way of reaching out and providing some education, providing some kind of research-based insights that parents actually can then access and, you know, take a position in terms of whether they agree with them or not, but just instead of this constantly finding themselves in a barrage of information that's, you know, pointing research findings in the one direction or the other direction, different kinds of outcomes depending on what different kinds of, you know, whether it's the screen, whether it's gaming, whether it's whatever it might be. And I think that there needs to be some effort to provide clarification there, I think, yeah.
Okay. We just convened with Eva that we're going to skip the risk-averse attitude of the Belgian parents, right? So let's move on to the principles that you discussed, Sonia. They're all fundamental, but what is for you a priority for the next research that we could embark on, for instance, if we talk maybe a follow-up of ySKILLS?
I don't know how much energy we have at the moment for that, Leen. So the principle of child rights is that they're indivisible and they cannot be ranked, so I'm not going to choose among the rights. I was developing the analogy early, maybe it's already out there, that it's like asking a child to choose would they like their hand or their foot. This is not a meaningful choice. They want the whole thing, and we want the whole thing for children's rights. But is the research needed? I mean, that was very striking, that in a way there was quite a lot of research on forms of inequality and exclusion, even though it doesn't mean that, you know, we can point that out and have equality delivered. There was a fair bit of research on parenting. We should have said something about how restrictive parenting doesn't help and doesn't support. But for me, I think a paper that Maria and I wrote right at the start of ySKILLS, mapping the evidence and looking about outcomes, I still think that over and again there's talk about the incredible value of gaining digital literacy, but not enough about what will follow. What is it for? And can we really show what it follows? And this is something that my colleague Ellen Halsper has worked on a lot. So that idea of tangible outcomes, that it really delivers, and that it delivers for children, that it advances their rights, but, you know, there are many other outcomes too. I now hear it in all the policy things. I mean, yes, we want digital literacy, but I'm saying, and what will it deliver? So what? What will it give? Does it make them more creative? Does it make them more political? Does it make them get better jobs? You know, we don't really have the data to show any of that. let alone what kids want it to be for.
Yes, thank you. Any other comment? Okay, on that? Another priority? No? Priorities?
No, I mean, but I think that we focus so much on the risks
Yeah.
and the safety, and that's important because, I mean, we have to have safety first, otherwise we don't have any opportunities at all. But then, yeah, I would just second that we don't have we have opportunities in terms of, I think that we were talking about activities and the number of different kinds of activities. That's how we operationalize opportunities at this stage in our research. So we do need to go further, I think, than that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to follow. I think and I want to follow up something also Christina touched upon earlier, that it is striking with all this worry and all this concern and everything going on, and I think it's in every country, it's like high on the agenda. Nobody is interested in really funding the type of research that can answer the questions that we all are struggling with and all want to answer, including longitudinal research. So ySKILLS, fantastic project. Lots of partners, lots of different methods, things are coming out, but it is a 4-year project. It ends, and after it ends, you know, and this is habitually what is going on. So maybe what is really needed is it's of course more research, but again more fundamental research over time. And again, I just say this, we're so worried, but we don't want the worry to go away, because if we wanted, we would fund the research.
I know. Well, Elisabeth is taking us in a depressing direction, so I'm going to be even more depressing now. So there is a debate going on over Europe, which I think our research really speaks to, and it's called Let's Ban Mobile Phones in Schools. And this is happening in this country, and another country, and it's sweeping. And you could almost call it an evidence-free policy, if I may be so bold. And we recently, in one of our projects, in responding to the British government, looked for the evidence that a mobile phone ban brings about any benefit whatsoever. And I challenge you to, if you have it, please let me know. But we couldn't find it. And at the same time, what was missing was the evidence that we have produced from ySKILLS, which is learning about technology and with technology in school can bring real benefits. So you take away the phone, you take away the most expensive bit of kit we've ever given children in a classroom because it's not safe and it's distracting them. And where is the conversation about what are the benefits we will thereby lose? So I really worry we're heading into our evidence-free policy debate, but I'm sure the world is going to do better than that.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, thank you. So what can we do better to really engage all the stakeholders together? Because you see, okay, we had one statement from an MEP. We don't have the business people here in this room either, although we invited some of them. So what could we do better to really have this inclusive dialogue, this conversation, and yeah, make more impact? From your experiences, what could we improve and should we improve? Anybody wants to add to that?
Yeah, maybe we're not always on the same team. Is that, am I allowed to say that? And maybe we're not always on the same team, but just drawing from not just this field, but generally in working, one of my side gigs is about academic freedom. And one of the most important things that come out of discussions about what is academic freedom is the importance of highlighting the value of research compared with other sources of information and knowledge. So research is a special kind of knowledge, which is based on fundamental principles, of strict methodological principles, of ethical principles. And if we are not able to speak out to what it means to have researched something rather than talk to somebody and written a report, which is something that many do, including private stakeholders, I think we will lose that debate, because then all information and all so-called findings are treated on the same level, and they're weighed on the, on the same level, also when parents and governments and policymakers hear them. So I think we need to first speak up for research and the value of research, and then they might listen.
Yes, and maybe to add to this, I think if we look at some of the legislative instruments, such as the Digital Services Act, it indeed provides for cooperation, also cooperation between policymakers and industry. You have this mechanism of codes of conduct. The age-appropriate design code has been mentioned already today. I think it can have a lot of potential, but it does require a constructive cooperation, constructiveness from all parties. We have an expert group with academics, with industry, organizations such as Eurochild. So the people are at the table. The people who know what needs to happen, what kind of measures will need to be agreed on, they are at the table. But everyone needs to have a constructive attitude to this. And I think in the past this has been sometimes problematic. I think we should remain optimistic. This is the way forward. This is what will happen and what needs to happen. But we can expect constructive attitudes and responsibility from all actors.
Okay, maybe as a last question to each of you, we all come from different countries here in Europe, and okay, we talked about pan-European perspective and what we can recommend to European policymakers and regulators. But if you now go back home and you take everything into account, what we have discussed and published and working on still in ySKILLS, what would be the urgent target group, the urgent at-risk group or vulnerable group that you would like to do research on in your national context? So maybe Niamh, could you start?
Well, I mean, at the risk of repeating what has already been said, I think that what's happening in Norway is this mobile phone debate, and it's huge, and the digitalization of schools. Yeah. And so there's a knee-jerk, I guess, reaction, evidence-free reaction to we've gone too far, we've gone too fast, we need to just reverse our track. And then, so the real need is to communicate the research that we do have, so that people know that, you know, we're not there in terms of supporting a ban, or, you know, the other way around. So we don't have evidence on either side, and therefore really need to think about what, why you would make measures. And then I think, yeah, so that would be the most important thing. And then also the fact that I think that policymakers, as has also been said here today, are constantly meeting, and researchers also, but we're constantly meeting this, why don't we have the research that we need to address the questions that we actually have? And I think that's super important, both in the national context and the international context, that we start looking at, we actually need to invest in more longitudinal research. We need to invest in panels, or we need to invest in whatever it is, so that we can see the relationship between these different variables and stop kind of just having the cross-sectional research that will give us interesting findings but not answers. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So many research questions. More research is definitely needed, including in the UK. So I think we said something earlier about vulnerable children, and I would love to, I think we need more research that clarifies the nature of vulnerability. Sometimes children are called vulnerable by the mere fact of being children, and other times, as we tried in our work on children with mental health difficulties or children who are refugees, we try to recognize vulnerability within that. So I don't really see much policy and regulation going on that recognizes vulnerability within vulnerability, that takes a kind of intersectional approach. So there is something for children, and it's a real challenge how it can be done and how it can be delivered, especially given that, as providers are always saying, they don't even know who's a child in the first place, let alone the circumstances of their lives. So I think we are, you know, there's a lot more nuance needed in research, but then that creates an additional challenge in bringing that effectively into kind of policy dialogue. So I don't have the answer, but that's kind of, that's where I think we need to go.
Yeah, I think for me, apart from our troubles in Norway, as Niamh described, which I have to, I think what I'm going to do is focus further attention on knee-jerk reactions in policy and regulations that are said to come in place or are demanded through media panics or through opportunist stakeholders using children as crowbar to introduce legislation, regulation, and other measures that are actually an infringement on children's rights, but are said to be there to protect them.
Thank you. I think from a legal and policy perspective, a lot is happening on the EU level, but we should not forget that the national level is also really crucial. As Niamh mentioned, areas such as education, youth, health, where things could really be done to help children, they are national competences to a large extent. So the national policymakers do have a lot of the tools and opportunities in their hands. And also, if we look at the legislation, okay, the instruments are EU level, but the enforcement will very often happen at the national level. So we should also not forget this national level, and especially for regulators, make sure that they have sufficient resources, and not only financial resources, but human resources. Having the experts in the regulatory authorities is really crucial. Also experts in children's rights, because it's such an important part of these legislative instruments. So we need the right people to make sure that the enforcement is really effective. So the national level is also definitely very important.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there anybody who wants to ask a question in the room here? Yes?
Thank you. Hello, thank you. It was really interesting. And actually, I was wondering, in the case of implementing the principles, how we can ensure that they are being followed in the environments that the child is interacting, or maybe, I don't know, a new research to define some indicators to measure more or less on what are your ideas about that?
Anybody wants to answer? Yeah.
I can start, so I can continue. I think it's a very good question, and I think this is the destiny of the researcher, is that we can only suggest, and we might feel we know best, but we have no power when it comes to implementation, other than perhaps repeating it. So we cannot. We can just hope that people listen and care about the quality of research over other types of input that comes in. Sorry, I'm so depressing today. I'm really.
No. Sometimes you're very cheerful. So I think there is. I think you used an interesting word in your question, which is the idea of indicators. And I think there is enormous potential in the ySKILLS research to produce the indicators, as it were, which, you know, for the researchers often hate indicators because it seems such a reduction. You know, we recognize all this complexity, and now you want to say, just use this one measure. But I think for policymakers, the one killer measure, as it were, the measure that will show whether something is working or not, can be incredibly useful, and for those advocating for child rights as well. So I think there is potential in the data that we have now collected to show which are the most discriminating, which are the most predictive, which will really, you know, and then we would say this short set, put it into your national or into Eurobarometer, whatever it is, and let's see if things are actually getting better or worse.
Okay, well, thank you. Other questions? No? It was a long day, so we started at 10 and now at 5 o'clock. So I think we did the whole tour d'horizon, starting with the data, the evidence in the morning, and then coming to the bridging activities, to education, to policy at the pan-European level, at the national level, and regulation. So the work isn't done yet, not at all. At least 3 years of more publications, I think, with all the data sets that we have. And I hope that we still will be able to spread that word. And yeah, as I said already several times, we'll take advantage of the presidency of Belgium in the council the coming 6 months, and hope to have, together with the people who were here from Mediawijs and from the European Schoolnet, to get this floor, have more evidence, and perhaps also be able to target, as Sonia said, to specific subgroups, so that we can make very tangible and very specific recommendations to policymakers. So I really hope that this is not the end. We will for sure work together, many of us in the EU Kids Online next round, right? And it's clear to me that if we have the money and we have the possibility to do that, we also have to include parents, not only children, but also parents' views, to see the discrepancies between perceptions and actual use and activities of children. So let's try to convince the European Commission to finance at least a couple of key countries if they don't want to sponsor or finance all of the 27 member states. So this is it for now, but of course keep on following us on our social media channels, and also the people online. Thank you very much for having followed us. If you have some questions for people in the room here, we will make sure that they will see your question and you'll get an answer. Thanks a lot for being with us. And we will go and have a drink, I think, to raise a toast to the results of ySKILLS and the dissemination. Thanks a lot for your attention.